Now, there are some parts of history which people just don't think are naval history. And whilst I must admit, in many areas of history, sometimes people can accuse naval historians of just being tourists. We turn up, we talk about a few events and a few things, but we then move on quite quickly because realistically, the major naval stuff is happening elsewhere, and that's going to take up the lion's share of interest. The joy of being a geek, and being as much of a geek about naval history and history in general as I am, is that it gives me so many areas where I can surprise people about there being naval history in them. And in this case, there's a lot to surprise people with, because we're talking about the 100 Years' War. Famous for Crécy and Agincourt and many other battles like the same. Most people forget that this is also the war which has the Battle of Slees, and, more importantly for today's discussion, although the Battle of Slees is pretty darn cool as the battles go, the Battle of Winchelsea, or the Battle of Les Espagnols sur Mer. The Spaniards on the Sea. Les Espagnols sur Mer. And it takes place on the 29th of August, 1350. 1350. Which is a nice long time ago. And it's rather fun to think about, realistically, that there is a battle which is 238 years prior to the Armada. 238 years prior to the Armada. Nearly 675 years ago, nearly 700 years ago, where it was the English versus the Spanish. Well, to be fair, it was the Castilians. But still, it's an interesting scenario you've got on, because in this battle, it's hard to argue the English don't win it. But they win it because of their commander and his leadership, and it's Edward III. And for those who don't know, I know there's lots of movies which make him out to be a very bad and evil man. He was not a nice man. I'm not trying to claim he was, but he was actually quite a successful king and quite an effective monarch. And one of the problems he has is that his successors aren't always so good. They really aren't always so good. I mean, he still doesn't get the full effect of Edward I, aka Longshanks, in history, but Edward III also sometimes gets a reputation as more a pithy one-liner than an actual serious king, and he was a very serious, very effective king, and a 50-year reign is a pretty darn successful thing for a monarch, especially in the period he's talking about. The fact he outlives his oldest son and is succeeded by his grandson, well, that's part of the problem, realistically. Sometimes you can live too long. There's also the problem that with a primogenitor line of succession, it goes down the male line, yes, but you can't go, well, you know what? Realistically, my grandson, he's, how do I put this politely? He was a bit young, being 10 years old. 10 years old when he achieves the throne. That is a problem. That is not a feature. It is most definitely a bug of the European system of inheritance and monarchy. Realistically, it should be a scenario that if they're not of age, they can't contend for the throne. But that is what it was. But Edward III, he was good. He was a good king. And he was very good at the intelligence of being king, i.e. making sure he always had more information than the other guy. Which is probably why at the beginning of the 100 Years' War, Philip VI of France was an idiot. And I mean this in the nicest way, because he has ambitions to unite France on his rule. And there's an issue. There's a major issue at this point. France suffers from having over mighty vassals. The biggest and most powerful of which is the King of England, technically also has lands in France. Gascony. Not Normandy anymore, but Gascony. Now, the thing is, rather like Normandy, they could have waited for literally a king to come along and go, I need to give one son this, make it all happy, split it all up, and Bob's your uncle. They're no longer, the two things are no longer combined. And considering the number of children which Edward III had, and the number of sons he had, it was probably going to happen pretty darn soon. There was a lot of contenders for a lot of lands. Running Gascony is lovely, but it's not like a kingdom. It's not like getting the Kingdom of England, and therefore it would have been split off. And then it would have been nice and easy. But you see, the trouble is there are two problems with that. One, Gascony was rich at this point and was a thriving financial hub. And two, Philip VI's courtiers had a lot of ambition. Philip VI himself, what can I say realistically? And realistically is what matters. He is paranoid and he feels fear. When he first comes to the throne, he's the nephew of Philip IV, not the son. And Philip IV was also grandfather of Edward III. Lovely things going on, and lots of relationships happening here. And, well, technically, therefore, both have quite a good claim to the throne. Now, if you keep to the agnatic line, you go, i.e. male line, you go to Philip VI. Now, Philip VI is paranoid about all these things. Edward III accepts it, is not really bothered. Edward III is off doing other things. He's got other problems right now. He really doesn't give a flying hoot. It doesn't matter that much to him. But it matters in Philip VI's mind, and it matters to some of his nobles. And he thinks he can get an easy victory. Now, the question you could ask is, why does Edward III not do what his father, Edward II, had done, and just go pay homage to the King of France to get his lands back? That's probably because Edward II was neither an Edward I nor an Edward III. He wasn't a Longshanks, and he wasn't a warrior. Edward II, that was his style. And the thing was, as much as it got him his lands, it made him weak in England. And one of the reasons why Edward II has the issues he has with controlling nobility in England and all the problems in England is because of how he treats the King of France. It's a very, very fine tightrope you have to walk. As that, you might be a duke in that one's lands and therefore a vassal, but you're a king in your own lands. And kings pay homage in different ways under these circumstances. Basically, if Philip VI of France had just wanted vassalage, he could have gone, right, I will confiscate this, unless you, of course, right, all vassalages, all things are confiscated until people come pay their homage to me. And then the King of England would probably send a note going, well, I suppose I'll do that. I was planning on coming for a diplomatic meeting with you anyway. Fancy a meeting in Calais or something like that, and there'd be a nice progression, fleets come together, friendship made, all these things. And while doing that, one of the many things done would be the homage. And that'd be fine. But that wasn't how it went down. And, well, the Duchy of Aquitaine, which is quite an important place and county of point of view, basically Gascony, at one point had covered more of France than, well, France. What can I say? And it's reduced, but it's still economically powerful and important. And Edward III remembers this. So this leads to conflict. It leads to conflict between the two because neither is willing to back down and both think they have a winning hand. Both think they have a winning hand. Unfortunately, Philip VI of France is not really what we call a warrior. Now, this is what the Edwardian phase of the Hundred Years' War is usually famous for. The Battle of Crécy in 1346, which is about 9 years into the war. There's a big chevauchée. It's before the battle we're talking about today, the Battle of Winchelsea. But it's after other battles which have taken place. And the thing is, naval battles are a major part of this war. Maritime trade, the economics of maritime trade to help fill the coffers of the various monarchs involved matter in this war. They always do, so it's unsurprising, realistically. This particular operation is famous because on his chevauchée, which is basically, how to put this, medieval linguistics for going for a walk with my large army, going to see what I find. If I find trouble, I'm prepared for it. A chevauchée is basically, I'm going to take all my friends, we're going to ransack this neighbourhood, and we're going to see what turns up, and maybe we get to fight a big battle, maybe we don't, we'll see. Realistically, he gets to fight his big battle, but if you notice, it takes a long while for the French to get organised, to actually engage him. And you actually have the battles up here, is Crécy is way up here. Way up here. He's come in, he's marched along, he's caused all sorts of trouble. He's had a little bit of fight outside Caen, but, you know, he's not going to have a little bit of a fight outside Caen. Parking there's a nightmare. But leaving that to one side, this is the Edwardian phase of the Hundred Years' War. This is what it's famous for, the Battle of Crécy, all these things going on. But from a naval history perspective, this war is also pretty darn rich. And I have done a video on the Battle of Sluys, on the fact that the French/Flemish forces, realistically, if we're talking about the margin, basically chain themselves up together. The idea being this would give them the strongest defensive formation to annihilate any English attackers. And the English basically go, right then, we're going to attack one end of the chain and fight our way along it. And they do. And it turns out, if you're all chained, you can't go and assist each other. It's terrible. But there's a whole video of it on this channel, because these battles are an important part of naval history. When they're talking about remembering your battles and remember the great English victories at sea when in the Armada period, when captains are exhorting their crews, they're bringing up Sluys, they're bringing up Winchelsea, they're bringing up these ones, partially remembered because Edward III ran a pretty decent propaganda machine for his period. He'd send out documents, updates, notes about what was going on, chronicles, to the various bishops and towns and, you know, wherever he could, they were going to be read out to the public. Okay, yes, it's not a Twitter feed, it's not what we call modern media campaigning, but for the 14th century, it's pretty darn good. It really is. For the 14th century. And that leads us to the geography of the war. Now, this is where we turn to the smallest member of the Nicholas Rogers trilogy of the naval history of Britain, Safeguard of the Sea, 1660 to 1649. And pages 79 to 80 have this passage on them, and it's about an earlier dispute. This is about the 1293 dispute. The immediate consequence of the 1293 dispute was the French occupation of Gascony. Supposedly temporary until the affair could be resolved, the economic value of England's remaining continental provinces was enormous. After the loss of Poitou, the English abandoned the white wines of that territory in favour of the light red wines, the clarets, from the country around Bordeaux. The wine trade grew in importance until by the early 14th century over 80,000 tonnes a year were being exported. That's 80,000 tonnes as in the barrel system used, which is the origin of the ton, T-O-N, but these were tons, T-U-N-S. Now, and at least 1,000 ships a year cleared the Gironde. The duty levied on wine exported through Bordeaux became equal to, sometimes greater than, the customs revenue of the whole Kingdom of England, while Bordeaux itself was the largest and richest city of the English Empire. In 1324, Gascony's net contribution to the English exchequer was £13,000. The growth of the wine-producing areas, however, coupled with the loss of territory to France, made it impossible for Gascony to feed itself. By the 14th century, English Gascony depended largely on grain, fish, and other commodities imported from England, so that the interruption of the regular convoys threatened famine in Gascony, as well as financial disaster for the English crown. The greatest seaport of Gascony was the wealthy and loyal city of Bayonne, whose ship owners handled much of the wine trade and contributed largely to English naval strength. Gascony and the Bordeaux trade, the ships they maintained and skills they required were the foundation of English mercantile naval strength in the Middle Ages. Now, the thing is, that was during the reign of Edward I. And it gets more as time goes on. As time goes on, you are talking an exponential growth. We are, in this period, talking about 1350. Considering those sums were for 1293 and 1324, we're talking between 57 and 26 years later. Things had only grown more complicated. Wine had only increased in production. The amount of demand for it had only increased. And this was before the Black Death hit England. So, yeah, it was big. And again, you always have to remember, the reason why they drink alcohol in this period so much more than water is because the alcohol tends to be safer than water. We have water purification. We do all sorts of things to our water to make it clean and safe to drink. In this period, whilst in theory, and you can often find clean water, like you can find clean water today, you can't be sure. You still, technically, you should always boil it at least if you're foraging and in places you don't know. And probably have water treatment tablets or various other systems to filter the water, because little bugs in it can cause a lot of nasty issues. So alcohol was safer. Alcohol was safer. Now, Gascony is the critical trading point. The critical trading point. And what you can see in terms of, I would say, the purplish, that's the old Empire of Aquitaine. That's the Angevin Empire. Gascony is an area which is interesting in terms of sovereignty status. England is, of course, England. And the blue area was, well, France. As you can see, there are some issues going on with this. There are some issues going on with this. And the geography of this war is going to define things. It's going to define where the operations take place. And one of the reasons why Gascony is also so important for the English in terms of trade, if you think about it, is you can get a ship down to Gascony. You can move goods from Gascony to the Mediterranean relatively easy. And then trade ships can go on through the Mediterranean, or alternatively it can be picked up by ships, and those ships can then travel on round Spain, through to Castile, etc. This is a trading point. This is a hub in a period where ships don't really do that long a time at sea, and there's a reason they don't. You see, and we'll get on to Charles de Lacerda in a bit, at this point the Mediterranean powers, specifically those in Spain especially, those on the Iberian Peninsula, well, they are moving on to the beginnings of Carvel built and what are going to be the foundation of caravels. Most of the northern construction of ships is still very much clinker. And clinker has an impact on the size and shaping of the hull you can get out there. Now, one of the interesting things you get in terms of the battle we're going to be talking about is whether or not there are caravels at the battle, or whether or not the ships at the battle are caravels on the Castilian side, because they're larger. I would say they are larger, yes. I don't think they've quite matured to what we would consider a caravel. They're more a Carvel-built cog than necessarily a caravel as it will become. But they are on the path to becoming a caravel. What people often forget is that these designs usually are iterative as things are found out and things improve. And what we would consider a caravel in terms of sort of something like this vessel, in terms of shaping and sizing, and some consider a cog, they are not that far apart, but they are far enough apart. And you can build bigger in caravel style. You can also build a ship which is going to be faster, smoother. And this is also another reason why the French do call in Charles de Lacerda, son of Louis de Lacerda, part of the Castilian royal family, disinherited part because, well, his great uncle disinherited, I think it's his grandfather or his father, and it's a whole different bit. But anyway, they've gone to their lands in France, and they're hired for roughly 20,000 florins a year to blockade the English Channel ports, although they were already engaging in such piracy. Or rather privateering to extent, I suppose. The thing is, the reason the French are having to hire them is because during the Battle of Sluys, the French fleet was pretty much wiped out. And then during this chevauchée, pretty much what Edward III seems to have been targeting, whether subconsciously or consciously, was every concentration of French shipping he could find. And breaking that as well. It was getting to the point that the French no longer had ships, let alone warships. They didn't have ships in the Channel. And this meant that the English were pretty much safe from French invasion, but we'll leave that to one point, because you can still build ships fairly quickly at this point. You know, they're clinker built and all various other things, so there's all sorts of options. But the thing is, you call him up, you call up his capabilities, his experience, and the fact that his vessels are larger than the English ones, this should be a good fight. And it is a good fight. And please note, Charles de Lacerda is not a bad commander. He has victories in his time, and there are many chances for him to win. But I would say in this battle, which we're talking about, Edward III has a small advantage. He has a far better intelligence machine than the French do. I'd say Lacerda learns that lesson and starts improving his intelligence machine. But realistically, the French never seem to be able to get it off the ground. That is a problem they continually run into in these kinds of operations, that their intelligence machine just won't do the work. But that being said, though, Shameless book plug. So, Shameless book plug, and well, I'm also going to plug this one as well, Safeguard at Sea by Nicholas Rogers. it's a this whole series. Do I agree with everything in there? All of them? No, I don't. It's always the fun thing when I find though people who go, well, I don't like this bit and this bit in a book, so I therefore don't rate it at all. No, Nicholas Rogers is writing a trilogy, and he's written a trilogy of books which give you a very good introduction to British naval history from, well, 660 till pretty much the end of World War Two, and a little bit after. It goes a little bit, a fair chunk after. And it's worthwhile reading. It's a great overview. And as all overviews like it are, there are bits which, frankly, you go, well, why have you gone into so much depth there? And other bits where they could have gone into more depth, and there are bits which are obviously have been paraphrased from other historians, and some bits which have been his own primary research, and that's fine. It's a good book to read. It's a good series to read because it gives you a great narrative to start building out your own block of knowledge of naval history. And I enjoy this fact. And I tend to use it with my students when I'm going, look, we're going to be teaching you this whole gamut of history from this period. These are some big trilogies which cover these periods. Usually they are trilogies of books. This is the trilogy on British naval history, Age of Sail. This will help you this bit. This will help you this bit. This is another trilogy. There's a trilogy on World War Two. There's a trilogy on World War One. There's a trilogy on various things. And some of them are not the most modern history books. They don't have the freshest of takes and the freshest of research in them, but they're still good narratives. And it's often important to go and read books like this because a lot of the work you are going to read, a lot of the books you're going to read for the next 20, 30 years until someone writes the next big trilogy on that period, and usually it is about 3-4 decades till you get another trilogy written on it, written on any period, because they are so much work, and they do require, the historian involved has to be sufficiently established they can go years without publishing, still retain their position, and still retain their income. Because you do not write a book like this in a year or 6 months. A book like this is 5-6 years' work. A trilogy is the work of a decade and a half, at the least. I think Nicholas Rogers' trilogy took him the best part of 2.5 decades. The best part of 2.5 decades. Seeing as this came out in 1997, and the part 3 came out, I think, in roughly 2025. So that's at least 28 years plus time to research. So actually, yes, it's probably 3.5 decades. They're worthwhile reading now. So thank you everyone for liking, sharing, subscribing, supporting the channel, and helping it grow. I hope you enjoy it when I do these random bits of extra areas of history which are not normally covered. I'm always trying to expand the channel to cover the full breadth of naval history and to go into further and further areas. I realise World War II and World War One is the most popular. I do know that when it comes to naval history, and I do know that if I don't do enough videos on World War One and World War Two, I suffer because they don't get the same logarithmic returns in the search. But I always try and throw these videos in because I think they're interesting and I think it's nice to expand. So I hope you enjoyed it. Now, just as England had Gascony as the reason for the existence of its mercantile trade, let alone for its shipping industry and as a source for a lot of its sailors and its larger ships, the French have Flanders. This had been the traditional heartland and base of their navy. And you can sort of tell that because if you look at the top there, you can see a place called Slees. And that's where a previous major battle had taken place, 1340. And this is where they're basing their fleets. This is where they're sustaining their fleets from. Even when Charles de Lacerda is coming up to do this operation, he doesn't want to run it from Castile. He's running it from here. This is where he's operating from. And let's be honest, Charles de Lacerda goes on to have a wonderful career with the French. Even after this battle, He goes on to become the Count of Anglouan and the Constable of France. He is very, very, very well connected. There's also the fact that, honestly, his death is probably what leads to the issues, which mean that there is instability in France non-stop for a decade between 1354 and 1364, which is probably also when the English come closest to wiping out France as an entity. There are various points in the 100 Years' War where it does look like England could win the whole thing. You know, they capture the King of France at one point, and theoretically, if things go better in certain campaign seasons, yeah, if it goes better. But ultimately, the problem for the English that was always the case was a lack of manpower, a lack of personnel that ultimately they couldn't overcome, and also the French geography. You can be very strong when you're within supporting range of the rivers and the sea that can lead you back, that get you back to the support from England. The moment you're disconnected from those, you're in trouble. You're on your own. And the French have far more logistics internally. Because again, it's two feudal countries, so logistics is interesting. Very interesting. That being said, what we have currently going on at this point is a whole lot of piracy, privateering. There had been various negotiations to try to renew the truce. Two painful nuncios had been trying to organise this, but they're both planning for a carry-on the war. And it's during this point that the French decide in Bruges hire the Castilian fleet and give them 20,000 florins. And then it starts to try and blockade the English Channel ports. Now, the thing is, it doesn't really do that, but it does take a lot of ships, and that causes problems. And then in June, a truce is agreed, the Castilians are named in it, and Philip VI ceases to pay them. However, the Castilians decide they're going to carry on doing it because they've been making so much money. They decide to do it as pirates. They'd added wooden castles, raised fighting platforms at the front of their vessels, at bow and stern, erected crow's nests, and all sorts of things to operate on this in this scenario. They'd hired Flemish crossbowmen. They'd hired all sorts of people for plundering. And I would say some of the reports, how do I put this? When we're looking at the reports of how effective they are, you have to remember that this is dressed up as a great victory by the king in propaganda. And you can't have a great victory over an opponent who wasn't achieving that much. You can only have a great victory over someone that was causing a lot of trouble. So, to an extent, the ferocious attack and the panic in English ports is overblown to an extent. To an extent. It is there, it's just some of the sources do harp on about it a bit more than it probably was reality. And so the English arrayed the fleet as best they could, the various coast guards and organisations. They called out the various ship towns, basically. And Edward himself decides to stick himself at Rotherhithe. He says he is going to confront the Castilians, and he does this on the 10th of August, 1350. He had the fleet rendezvous at Kent. Sandwich, specifically, was what they were aiming for. Now, the thing is, the advantage that Edward III has over his counterpart, Charles III, in this battle, is that Charles has virtually no intelligence on what Edward III is doing. Yet Edward III knows the composition of the Surdus fleet, when it sails, and the personnel aboard. He has everything. So when he hears they're sailing with 50, he says they're sailing with ships, and he takes out 50 ships. He knows they're smaller than the majority of the Castilian vessels, and many of them are very much smaller. But he's loaded up the fleet with 2 of his sons, as many nobility as he can get, and as many men-at-arms and archers as he can get. And the thing is, he knows that the Castilians are bringing roughly 47 ships, but he also knows they are travelling in disparate groups. He's got a target. He knows what he's going for. He really knows what he's going for. So on the afternoon of the 29th of August, the English fleet's off Dungeness. Edward is sitting on the deck of his ship, and he is being serenaded by young John Chandos, who is, how do I put this politely? He's very capable of using all the arts God gave him to advance. He is a capable administrator, he's a capable diplomat, he's a very capable soldier, and he's also capable at singing and doing all the other things which are associated with the finery of arts. It's one of those curious things of history, I find, that some days we have discussions these days of what makes a manly man, and honestly I can't think of anything which sort of fits the ideals more than some of the warriors we're looking at in this period, in their terms of they are willing to pick up sword, spear, they're hunting, they are doing all those things. Yet at the same time, they consider it only natural. They indulge in the pursuits of history, of art. That they balance science with the arts. That you go for being a rounded human being. You don't be one thing or the other. You be both. And they consider that important to understanding war, to understanding the world. That you needed to be of both worlds to fully understand the world you were of. And to be honest, if you told them about some of the modern debates we have of STEM or arts, you should be, you have to be one or the other, they'd probably think you were being a bit nuts. Because it's always both. It's always the roundness and the fullness of human life is both. That's the joy of it. But yes, they're sitting there singing, they're playing German airs, there's all sorts of things going on, and at 1600 hours, they see De la Cerda's forces moving towards them with an easterly wind behind. And this is important. Because, honestly, the Castilian ships are probably slightly faster, and are slightly bigger, as said. But they had become scattered, thanks to the wind behind them. And thus, the English decided to target the main body, which was roughly 24 of the 47 vessels. This was something Edward had anticipated. And with his lookout spotting them, Edward, all his group, take a drink to each other's health. They sound the trumpets, and they stand line out. There's nothing like we'd call naval artillery really at this point. There's no guns, there's no really big catapults as the Romans had, and systems the Romans had. This is going to be an infantry fight at sea. And to ensure they do that, and ensure the Castilians don't sweep past them in the wind, the English also decide to run before the wind. But they do so by shortening their sails, so they allow themselves to be overtaken. So they are running ahead into the wind. They're literally allowing the Castilians to come up behind them and join into the fight. This means there's roughly an hour before fighting commences. There's an hour where the Castilians are trying to bring their force together, and where the English are forming this sort of half-moon shape, waiting for the Castilians to come into them. And this is the fight. The manoeuvring is pretty darn difficult, as you can imagine, from such an operation. And the Cog Thomas, which was the king's own ship, managed to strike the Castilian it's trying to grapple so heavily it springs a leak. At the second attempt, though, so it hadn't been leaking that badly, they successfully grapple. The archers aboard, longbowmen, are putting down such a weight of fire, that the Castilians are deterred from trying their normal tactic of trying to drop large rocks and things from the higher decks. And, well, the English are using scaling ladders. They have quite literally bought scaling ladders. They describe the Castilian ships as like castles to their cottages, and there is certainly a height advantage, but I'm not quite sure if it's a castle to a cottage level, if you know what I mean. I think there's a little bit of inflation going on there in the storytelling. And so the English men-at-arms board the ships and start clearing its deck. Edward, once he's secured this ship, transfers his flag there as the Cog Thomas is sinking. And at this point, that means they chuck the Castilian crew in the sea. This was the standard policy at this time. If you captured an enemy ship, you chucked the crew in the sea. You didn't allow for survivors. You just heaped them over the side, unless they decided to join you, or were appropriately wealthy that their capture was going to be financially remunerative. And it's not just Edward's own ship which gets into this trouble. It's not just Edward's own ship. Edward Woodstock, aka Edward Prince of Wales, aka Edward the Black Prince, Edward the Third's eldest son, and such a shame he dies when he does, dies before his father, and that creates all the trouble, realistically, had a very similar time. His ship, well, it was pretty much foundering even before he'd taken the enemy ship. He didn't really have much of a choice. It was take them or die. However, they were assisted by the fact that his uncle, Henry of Lancaster, stormed the other side. Always nice. And by that I mean he's also Henry Lancaster's also the Plantagenet family. He's not yet a duke at this point from memory, but he is a direct descendant from Henry III. By I think grandson of Henry III from memory. And so Plantagenet family, cousin, older one, uncle. Gets on well with Edward III, is pretty much Edward III's most reliable captain, and is also very good and very loyal to Edward III's son, Edward Prince of Wales. So it's unsurprising that Edward's in trouble. Oh, Dad sorted himself out. My nephew is in trouble. Right then, I am boarding this ship from the other side. He is a very powerful, very capable noble, and a very important member of Edward III's forces. He doesn't get as much talked about him as he probably deserves. And the fact is, the dual attack is kind of like how a lot of this battle goes, because they have a number advantage over this group, this central group. And so King Edward's party is encouraged by Henry of Lancaster's aid. The Spaniard has surrendered. Her entire crew was then flung overboard. And, the prince had to shift his command to that vessel again because his cog sunk. But don't worry, that's fine. Henry of Lancaster's cog is okay, and he's off after another ship because he's sure there's something else out there he can get. The crossbowmen were causing a lot of casualties. They were causing problems, but the main trouble they keep running into is the sheer weight of fire coming from the longbowmen. And whilst they're in elevated positions, again, the longbowmen are putting down heavy fire coming in over the top. They are literally doing ballistic trajectories. We're going to cover that entire position with arrows coming down from above, and it makes it very difficult to fire. Because whilst you might be wearing a helmet, You may have a helmet on. Your arms, your shoulders could well be exposed, and yes, it's not much of a space when you're firing a longbow or trying to maneuver to load and fire a longbow, but it exposes parts of you and the arrows are coming down. The Castilian vessels keep trying to drop iron bars, they keep trying to drop lumps of stone, anything they can into the English vessels to cause trouble, but the English are pursuing a policy mostly of what we would call vessel exchange. Their vessels are getting smashed up, they know they are, but they're taking yours, so that's fine. They're being very careful how they treat yours. Yeah. And it carries on. It carries on really until nightfall. And then you have the conclusion of the fight. The conclusion of the fight. At the English vessel La Salle de Reuil, carrying quite a few of the king's household, commanded by the Fleming gentleman, Robert of Namur, is grappled by a large Castilian ship, and it's being dragged off. And, well, Hannequin, one of Robert's valets, boards that vessel, cuts the halyards of her mainsail with his sword, gets severely wounded in the process, but by some accounts does seem to survive. And this allows the other English ships to catch up with the Castilian, and it's then taken. There is a debate as to how many vessels the English captured. Some say 14, because they return with roughly 64 vessels. But others, the figure seems to be most likely about 26, because so many of the English vessels get sunk taking those vessels. So they capture roughly 26, they return with 64, they started with 50. Work out the maths. They lost a lot of their cogs in that battle. And it was heavy losses. There were virtually no prisoners taken, and most of the wounded Castilians and Flemings were thrown overboard. And it was mostly this battle it was actually visible from Winchelsea and was actually spotted and watched, and there are accounts written by people from the shore watching it going on. The surviving Castilian ships, well, they weren't pursued, but they fled to French ports. They were joined by further French ships and continued to harass English shipping. But eventually they withdrew to Slees to winter. And the following spring, they again came out. And again, trade with Gascony was affected, but affected far less. And there are large English ships wandering around. And there are large English ships also carrying out piracy of their own on French cargoes and causing similar trouble. Now, some of the battles which take place get a lot less attention this time period than this Winchelsea, and that's probably because the king wasn't there. But the king was getting a reputation, and this was being expected of the English, of being hard naval fighters. If we are going to look at a period and look for when the English start to imagine they are capable naval warriors and capable at fighting at sea and should be capable at fighting at sea, that's more important. They have the self-image that they should be capable of fighting at sea. People today would often trace it back and people go, well, it's the Armada, it's 1588, and it's not. It's right back here. It's right back in 1340. It's right back in 1350. It's at the beginning of this 100 Years' War. That's when the English start to perceive themselves, thanks to, in many ways, the propaganda machine of Edward III and his spreading about his victories and the battles that fought. Now, the battles were successful, but they weren't entirely successful. They didn't end the war. And our main accounts do come from Jean Froissart. They also come from Thomas Walsingham, Robert Aysbury, and later a gentleman called John Stowe. But the fact is, there isn't much archaeology that survived these battles. There isn't much. And so we have the accounts and we try and study for information, but battles in the Channel have been ruined by some of the activities that have gone on in the Channel over the years. There has been a lot of activity in the Channel, and it has in many ways covered up a lot of the potential archaeology. So we know what we know, we don't know much more. But it is a very interesting period of history. And my question to you is this. How do you think things change if you do have artillery, like the Romans had, still in this time period, for ships? And what kind of artillery do you think each side will be fielding? Considering the crossbow, longbow tendencies of both nations and how they adapt and how they focus on their force structures, what do you think that would affect their choice of artillery if they had it? I'd be really interested to hear what you think. Thank you very much and take care. Hope you enjoyed the video. What have we got coming up? Well, when this video comes out, this is the Battle of Winchelsea, and this is August. Goes out. This one's going, when it goes live, is going to be a Saturday some point next year in 2026. So hello to the future. I hope you're having a wonderful time. I hope there are great videos coming up. I know there are. I just haven't finished writing up the year's thing. Just put it here instead of the year of leadership. But thank you very much, and thank you for supporting the channel, and hope you like, share, and subscribe, and help the channel grow. I hope I'm at 20,000 subscribers by this point. I hope I won Christmas and the Christmas bet's over. I do. I so hope. Thank you very much, and take care. Bye.